One village, two governments, two completely different answers about who controls it. Ukraine's general staff lists it as held. A Russian Ministry of Defense statement the same week says it already fell. And when independent analysts pull up the same satellite images and geolocated footage, the honest answer, more often than not, is it's still too early to say. The gap between what governments announce and what the evidence actually supports is the real story of the fighting in Donbas right now. Not one dramatic breakthrough, but a slow, grinding argument over small pieces of ground, fought almost as much in daily briefings as in trench lines. This video isn't about deciding who's winning. It's about showing you how that argument actually gets settled, what Ukraine's general staff reports each day, how outside analysts check it, where the two line up, and where they quietly don't. Start with the official record. Ukraine's general staff publishes a daily operational update, a running account of where fighting occurred, which directions saw the most attacks, and, in general terms, how many assaults were repelled. It's a real, primary source, and reporters and analysts read it every single day. But it's also, by design, a wartime communication from one side of the war. It's written to inform the Ukrainian public and allied governments, not to hand an opponent a precise map of gains and losses. Names of specific settlements appear, but exact frontline coordinates, unit positions, and the full scope of setbacks generally don't. That's not unique to Ukraine. Every military in every war of the last century has managed its own casualty and territory reporting carefully. The reports aren't dishonest so much as incomplete by nature, and treating any single day's bulletin as a finished picture of the war misses how the information actually has to be assembled. That's where open source analysis comes in. Groups like the Institute for the Study of War, known as ISW, and the Ukrainian mapping project Deep State take a different approach. Instead of relying on official statements alone, they cross-reference geolocated combat footage, usually drone video or infantry footage posted by soldiers on both sides against satellite imagery, to confirm, tile by tile, who actually appears to hold a given tree line, road junction, or village. It's slow, unglamorous work. A single contested settlement can take days or even weeks to move from reported to assessed as confirmed on their maps, because a claim only gets upgraded once there's visual evidence that actually pins a soldier, a vehicle, or a flag to a specific, verifiable location. Behind that process sits a less visible layer of work that rarely makes it into any headline: debriefs. When a unit rotates out of a contested position, officers on both sides sit soldiers down and walk through, hour by hour, what they actually saw, which basement they sheltered in, which direction incoming fire came from, whether the tree line to the east still had a machine gun position in it by the time they pulled back. None of that gets published, but analysts who've spoken with soldiers after the fact say those debriefs, cross-checked later against drone footage time-stamped the same day, are often what finally resolves a contested claim, not the footage alone and not the official bulletin, but the two lined up against each other. I spent a good chunk of time this week just scrolling back through weeks of these daily assessments side by side, general staff updates on one screen, ISW's control of terrain maps on the other, and one thing kept jumping out. It's not that the two sources contradict each other constantly. Most days, they're broadly aligned on the big picture. It's the small, specific disagreements that are the most revealing. A village Kyiv describes as under Ukrainian control that outside analysts still mark as contested for another 10 days because the footage simply hasn't caught up yet with the claim. There's a real obstacle built into this process, and it's worth being honest about it. Verification takes time, and the war doesn't wait for it. Analysts have described cases where a settlement changes hands 2 or 3 times inside a single week, sometimes because of a genuine counterattack, sometimes because initial claims were simply premature. By the time enough footage exists to confirm the situation on a map, the situation on the ground may already have moved on again. Both Deep State and ISW handle this the same way. They mark uncertain areas as contested or unconfirmed rather than guessing, and they revise their assessments, sometimes walking claims back as better evidence comes in. That willingness to say, "we don't know yet," is, honestly, the most useful signal either source offers. Inside the analyst teams themselves, the actual evidence processing looks almost administrative. Every clip that comes in, whether it's posted by a soldier's own unit, scraped from a Telegram channel, or forwarded by a source, gets logged. Upload time, claimed location, visible landmarks, weather, shadow angle, even the condition of specific damaged buildings that show up in multiple videos over multiple weeks and can be used like fingerprints. 2 or 3 analysts will independently try to match a single video against satellite tiles before it's allowed to move a map marker from gray to a confirmed color. If they disagree, the clip sits in a queue, unresolved, sometimes for days, until a second or third piece of footage either confirms or contradicts it. It's closer to evidence cataloging in a criminal case than to conventional war reporting, and that's deliberate. The whole method exists because claims alone, from either side, have proven unreliable often enough that nobody serious treats them as sufficient anymore. Take one recent contested settlement as an example, without hanging everything on a single unverifiable data point. Ukrainian officials describe it as held, footage from the other side suggests otherwise, and for a stretch of days, independent trackers simply mark it gray, contested, while they wait for confirmable video. Eventually, one side's claim gets more support than the others, and almost immediately attention shifts to the next contested tree line down the road, because that's how this stretch of the front has worked for years now. Not a single decisive line, but a chain of small, disputed positions, each one taking its own separate argument to resolve. Behind each of those gray markers on a map is usually a village that, until recently, had people living in it. In the weeks before one recent settlement became contested on the trackers, local authorities had already run a slow, partial evacuation, mostly older residents who'd stayed through years of shelling because leaving meant abandoning a house, a garden, sometimes livestock they'd raised for decades. Aid workers who helped with that evacuation have described the same pattern repeatedly. Families waiting until the artillery was close enough to hear individual shells land before agreeing to go, then arriving in a resettlement town with almost nothing, waiting for news about a house that, weeks later, would only exist as a pixelated shape on a satellite image analysts were arguing over. That's the layer underneath the map colors that rarely gets its own sentence in a briefing. This pattern isn't new to 2026. It echoes what happened around Bakhmut in 2022 and 2023, and again around Avdiivka in the following year, periods where official Ukrainian and Russian statements diverged sharply from what open-source analysts could actually confirm on the ground, sometimes for weeks at a stretch. In both of those cases, the eventual, verified outcome usually landed somewhere between the two governments' initial claims, real Russian advances, but slower and costlier than Moscow's own announcement suggested, and Ukrainian withdrawals that were more contested and gradual than collapse narratives implied at the time. That historical pattern is useful context here, not because history repeats exactly, but because it tells you what kind of gap to expect between announcement and confirmation, and roughly how long that gap tends to last. Here's what strikes us most, looking at this process from the outside. The disagreement itself is a kind of data. When Kyiv, Moscow, and independent analysts all describe the same stretch of front the same way, that's a strong signal the situation is genuinely stable. When their accounts diverge sharply, that divergence is usually pointing at exactly the sector where the fighting is most fluid and where the eventual outcome actually matters most for the wider war. Reading the disagreement, not just the individual claims, is often more informative than trusting any single source in isolation. Which brings us to the harder question underneath all of this. Does any of it actually change the shape of the war? Here's an unpopular take, and we'll say it plainly. Individual village-level gains, on either side, are consistently oversold by both governments for morale purposes, and audiences on both sides of this war are, understandably, primed to want a clean, singular story of momentum that the actual battlefield rarely provides. A contested settlement changing hands is real news for the people fighting over it. It is very rarely, on its own, a turning point for the war as a whole. That's the nature of what analysts call a war of attrition. Rather than one army breaking through and racing toward a capital, both sides have spent extended periods fighting over the same limited stretch of contested territory, trading small tactical gains at a significant cost in personnel and equipment on both sides. In that kind of fight, the meaningful measure isn't which flag is on which building this week. It's the trend line over months, which side is gaining ground faster than it's losing manpower and equipment to hold it, and which side can sustain that exchange rate longer. That's a much harder thing to report in a single headline, which is exactly why daily "who controls what" claims get so much more attention than the slower attrition math underneath them. So how do you, watching from outside the war, actually tell the difference between noise and signal? A few honest rules of thumb. First, treat single-day claims from either government as provisional, not final. That's not cynicism, it's just how wartime reporting works everywhere. Second, look for independent confirmation before treating any territorial claim as settled. A claim with matching geolocated footage from multiple angles is worth far more than a claim with none. Third, watch the trend across weeks and months, not the headline from a single day. A village changing hands twice in a month tells you the front there is unstable. It doesn't, by itself, tell you which direction the wider war is moving. And fourth, pay attention to what the analysts themselves say they're unsure about. The contested and unconfirmed labels on a map like deep states are often more informative than the confirmed ones, because they show you exactly where the real argument is happening right now. What would you do with that kind of fog if it were your job to report on it in real time, knowing that both getting it wrong and getting it right have real consequences for how people understand a war that's still going on? It's worth sitting with that for a second before assuming the daily map is ever the full picture. Where does that leave things right now, as of this summer? The honest answer is contested and actively moving in a small number of specific sectors along the Eastern Front, with Ukraine's general staff and Russian officials continuing to offer diverging characterizations of who holds what and independent analysts working, as always, a few days behind the claims, trying to confirm them with actual footage rather than statements alone. Some specific settlements mentioned in recent reporting remain genuinely unresolved even to close observers, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise here. What is reasonably well established is the pattern itself. Neither government's daily claims should be taken as the final word, and the slower, verified picture from open-source trackers, however unglamorous, has consistently proven closer to accurate over the course of this war than same-day announcements from either side. One detail that stuck with me through all of this: the analysts doing this verification work aren't chasing the dramatic story. They're chasing the boring, confirmable one, the single clear frame of video that actually proves a claim out of thousands of frames that don't. That's not a glamorous job, and it rarely trends. But it's arguably the most important journalism happening around this war right now, because it's the only thing standing between the public and simply taking either government's word for it. We're not going to pretend this video resolves the argument over who's ahead in Donbass, because, honestly, that argument doesn't resolve in a single video, or even in a single month. What we can tell you is how to watch it more carefully going forward. Check the primary source, check whether independent analysts have confirmed it, and be skeptical of anyone, on either side, presenting a single day's claim as the whole war. If there's a specific settlement or sector you've seen conflicting claims about and want us to dig into with the same approach, tell us in the comments. That's genuinely how future videos in this series get picked. For now, the takeaway is a simple one. In a war fought this closely, the map isn't finished the moment a government says it is. It's finished when the evidence catches up. Check the primary sources for yourself, give the open source trackers time to confirm what they can, and treat the gap between claim and confirmation as the most honest part of the story.